Monopoly is the best-selling board game of all time. Over 275 million copies have been sold worldwide, and you have almost certainly played it, and you've almost certainly finished that game in a state of barely contained rage, swearing never to play it again. A vow you have broken, statistically speaking, at least 4 times. But did you ever stop to wonder where this magnificent engine of familial destruction actually came from? I mean, the true story of Monopoly's origin contains none of the elements that makes The Princess Bride so compelling. It has no fencing, fighting, torture, revenge, giants, monsters, chases, escapes, true love, or miracles, but it does contain a villain, a victim, a corporate cover-up, and an irony so perfectly structured that one might reasonably suspect the universe arranged it on purpose, which it almost certainly did not, though it's the sort of thing the universe would do if it were in that kind of mood. Our story begins, as so many interesting stories do, not with the person who gets the credit, but in this case with a woman named Lizzie Maggi, who was born in 1866 in Macomb, Illinois. Now, Lizzie was, by any reasonable measure, an extraordinary human being, and by any measure a deeply inconvenient one for the people who would later try to pretend she didn't exist. At various points in her life, she worked as a stenographer, typist, story writer, poet, comedian, stage actress, activist, feminist, engineer, news reporter, and game designer. A list so comprehensive it reads less like a resume and more like a list of categories on LinkedIn. And, as it turns out, she was also a Georgist, which is an economic philosophy involving land taxation that is, quite frankly, too sensible to have ever caught on properly. But the relevant detail for our purposes is that Georgists are very much against land monopolism, and in 1903, Lizzie sat down and did something wonderfully passive-aggressive about it. She invented a board game. She called it the Landlord's Game, and her stated intention was to teach people about the ill effects of land monopolism. Now, the game had 2 modes. One, in which players competed to build monopolies and crush their opponents economically, and one called Prosperity, in which players cooperated for mutual benefit. Now, Lizzie's hope was that people would play both, recognize the cooperative version was more enjoyable and morally coherent, and draw appropriate conclusions. But this was, in hindsight, spectacularly optimistic. She filed for a patent for the game in 1903 and received it in 1904. In 1906, Lizzie teamed up with 2 fellow Georgists, E.H. Monroe and E.G. Lenbusher, whose names read like obscure British authors for works you reluctantly read as part of class assignments that you stayed up late to finish the night before they were actually due. But together they formed the Economic Game Company and began self-publishing the Landlord's Game, and it sold reasonably well in the northeastern United States. In 1909, and emboldened by this modest success, Lizzie approached the Parker Brothers Game Company about publishing the Landlord's Game along with a card game she invented called Mock Trial. Now, Parker Brothers agreed to publish Mock Trial, but they passed on the Landlord's Game on the grounds that it was too complicated, which, if you've ever watched or listened to an interview with a corporate executive, is not entirely surprising. In 1910, an economics professor named Scott Nearing discovered the game, and he liked it enormously. In fact, he liked it so well that he introduced it to his students at the Wharton School of Finance, and they liked it too. Then they did what college students have always done with things they like: they started fiddling with it. New boards were designed, rules were tweaked, variants proliferated, and several of these variants became popular enough to acquire their own names, including Finance, Auction, and one you may have heard of, Monopoly. The game soon spread from university campuses to other communities, notably the Quaker communities of Atlantic City and Philadelphia. Now, a pair of Quaker brothers named Jesse and Eugene Rayford, who happen to live in Atlantic City, renamed the properties on their version of the board after actual Atlantic City locations. And these are the names that appear on the Monopoly board today: Boardwalk, Park Place, and Baltic Avenue. Lizzie's original patent eventually expired, in the same way that a goldfish out of its bowl invariably does, and back taxes don't. But in 1923, she applied for a new one, received it in 1924, and in 1932 made arrangements to publish the game yet again under the name The Landlord's Game and Prosperity. She was, at this point, still fighting to maintain some connection to the thing she had created 30 years earlier. Meanwhile, fate had other plans. In a suburb of Philadelphia, a man named Charles Darrow was having what might charitably describe as a difficult decade. He had been a heater salesman before the stock market crash in 1929, and after the crash, he worked a series of odd jobs to make ends meet. Now, at some point, Charles noticed that rather a lot of people he knew were playing variations of the landlord's game, and he decided to investigate. Now, he's introduced to the Atlantic City version, the one with the Rayford brothers' property names, and he recognized immediately that there was money to be made. He enlisted his wife and son, set up a production operation in their home, and hired a graphic artist to develop the visual elements that players still recognize today, including the red arrow on Go, the locomotive icons on the railroad spaces, the faucet on Waterworks, the light bulb on the electric company, and the question marks on the chance cards. Now, Charles copyrighted the game in 1933, and by 1934 was selling copies to Wanamaker's department store in Philadelphia. He approached the Milton Bradley Company about publishing the game, but they weren't interested. He approached Parker Brothers, but they also passed, citing what they described as 52 fundamental errors in the game's design, a statement which has proven over the decades to be incredibly ironic. So Charles continued selling the game himself, and then a curious thing happened. He started getting orders from other Philadelphia department stores, and at that point Parker Brothers noticed, and those 52 errors started to seem radically less fundamental. Negotiations began, and Charles proved himself to be a shrewd operator. He copyrighted the game again in 1935, just to be safe, and Parker Brothers, now actually paying attention, discovered that the game was ultimately derived from Lizzie Maggie's Landlord's game, and they realized they should probably speak to her as well. They even began designing their own alternative game, called Fortune, in case negotiations with either party collapsed. They needn't have worried. Lizzie agreed to sell her patent to Parker Brothers for $500 and no royalties. No royalties, $500, for the patent that was the foundation of what would ultimately become the best-selling board game in history. Meanwhile, Charles sold his publishing rights and began collecting royalties. By the end of 1936, Parker Brothers was producing 20,000 copies of Monopoly every week. It became the best-selling game in the United States for that year, and Charles Darrow went on to become the first millionaire game designer in history. Lizzie Maggie published a few more games, but none of them really took off. She died in 1948 at the age of 81, largely forgotten and definitely not wealthy. Her role in the creation of Monopoly was rediscovered, somewhat accidentally, sometime after 1973 when an economics professor named Ralph Ansbach produced a game called Anti-Monopoly. It was similar enough to Monopoly that Parker Brothers filed a lawsuit, and the resulting trial lasted 10 years, and somewhere in the course of all that litigation and billable hours, Lizzie's contributions were finally dragged back into the light and acknowledged. Which brings us, at last, to the twist, and it is, in fairness, quite a good one. The game that was invented specifically to demonstrate the ruinous, soul-crushing effects of monopolistic capitalism, the game that was designed from the ground up as anti-monopoly propaganda, has generated billions of dollars for a series of corporations that spent decades aggressively protecting their monopoly on Monopoly, while the woman who created it received $500, no royalties, and the particular kind of obscurity that history reserves for people who are inconveniently right about everything. Thank you for watching. Cheers.